about their experience with surveys in their research. So before I do that, please give them a round of applause.
I'm Justin Patchin. I teach in the criminal justice program in the Department of Political Science. I've been here since 2004. I did my first independent survey endeavor in 2001 and took about 18 months to get through an IRB because I was among the first to do online survey research at Michigan State University. They didn't know how to do it, they didn't know how to do consent, and so I've learned a lot along the way. Have done, I don't know, a couple dozen surveys, mostly of youth, which creates its own challenges. So happy to talk about these issues.
Peter Hart-Brinson, I teach in the Sociology and Communication Journalism departments. I think my main claim to being on this panel is that I do a survey every year as part of the Sociological Research Methods course. It's a campus-wide survey that we do every spring, and this is the 8th year. We call it the Eau Claire Longitudinal Student Survey. And so the students in the class work in groups and they design a short questionnaire on a topic of their choice. And we take all of the questionnaires designed by all the student groups, and I usually field a couple of questionnaires from faculty and staff around the university, and we combine them all into one single instrument and then email it out to a random sample of currently enrolled students. And it's been really a great learning experience for the students, and we've learned a lot about kind of the student body over the years as well. So I have a lot of experience with, really with using the survey on campus, and we can talk about that. So, thanks.
I'm Jeff Goodman. I teach in psychology, and I feel as though survey questions are included in just about any type of research that I'm going to conduct. It just comes down to whether survey its entirety is the design of the study or whether it's just part of the research. I would say that I've become more reliant on surveys over the years as increasingly more difficult to encourage or incentivize, especially students, to come into the lab to sit there for an hour to go through behavioral observations of different sorts, at least too difficult in any way that wouldn't be thought of as being over what would be expected or allowable, incentivized, right? But, yes.
Okay, well, I'm April. I'm also in psychology.
Some degree of determination that they are consistent or internally reliable as an instrument, and even better, there might be some validation that demonstrates that that measure is actually measuring what we hope it is going to measure. And that's hardly ever the case when we are drafting our own survey questions for the very first time.
I would build on that in the sense that, the area I study most often is cyberbullying. And so the first study we did, there weren't any instruments on how to measure cyberbullying. And so we sort of made something up, and we, in our very first survey, included one very open-ended qualitative question saying, tell us about your most recent experience with cyberbullying, so that we could draw our items from those experiences. And that was, in 2002 or 2003. And I probably get 2 or 3 requests to use our instrument a week. People email me from all over the world saying, we're studying cyberbullying. Can we use your instrument? And we just send it out. I mean, if we were to charge $1 each, we'd be in good shape right now. But so yeah, and I think that's fairly common in the academic community to share instruments, and especially when it's being used internationally, we ask them to send us back if they do any reliability, or if they translated the instrument, we ask for examples of that. But typically academia is a pretty sharing environment when it comes to instruments or scales.
I guess I would back up a step, and I think before I got to look to measures, which I think is definitely a key, what has been for me the first step is to understand what the question really is.
Mhm.
So I very frequently have conversations where maybe a student says, I'm interested in students, I'm interested in their social media use and mental health. And this is a really big, popular topic, but there's a lot in that phrase, right? So what do you mean by mental health first? But then social media use, I'll be like, what do you mean by social media use? Like, we have to have many conversations of like, what do you mean by use? Do you mean why they use it? Which social media apps they're using? How often they use them? Like, if they're looking at time spent on social media, is a survey even the best way to go? That's not necessarily the most reliable measure. Or if you're going to ask them about their time, how are you going to ask them about their time? Are you going to ask them to pull up their phone and give them instructions on how to find out how much time they spent over the past day, over the past 7 days? I mean, like, just the phrase use of social media has so many elements to it. And so it's just unpacking, what do you really want to know? Which I think helps, I think that helps encourage the literature search to be more effective too, when like, if you're interested in motivations for social media use. I think about some of the first researchers that looked at that question of social media use and mental health asked about time spent on the internet
Mhm.
and mental health.
Mhm.
And you're probably thinking, time spent on the internet.
Mhm.
What, we do everything on the internet now, right? Like,
Yep.
by the time they got those data published, people were like, that's meaningless, right?
Mhm.
So meaningless. So really honing in on what are the variables that you're really trying to understand is hard. I think that's the hardest step before you even design a survey. Or look for a survey.
Part of the issue for me is that surveys have now become the default. I want to know something. Let's do a survey.
Mhm.
I mean, with the advent of online polling,
Mhm.
the costs of being able to implement a survey are basically zero. And on campus, like, they are literally zero for us, because anybody here can go onto, log in with their credentials, create a Qualtrics, account, create a survey, send it out to whoever. And so surveys are now like the junk mail of research methods. I mean, like, Justin's example is a great example of like, yeah, here's an example of like when a survey research actually tells us something meaningful. But 3/4 of the time, as someone says to me, I'm thinking about doing a survey about this, it's not too hard for me to talk them out of it because there's a better way.
Mhm.
Either because you haven't thought about what we're actually measuring, or because we haven't done the literature, or because, for whatever reason.
Mhm.
And so I would just encourage everyone to go in with a skeptical mind. Surveys are so easy to do, but just because they're easy to do, is it really? Yeah, is it
It
really?
doesn't mean they're easy to do well,
Right.
but which takes some experience, I think, for us to, you know what I mean? Like, Pam, I saw you nodding and you're like, yep, I felt that, right? But I think most students start out thinking it's the easier option. But it's also, again, this is related to understanding the question. Like, if you're thinking about research or students' research, and sorry if I constantly gravitate toward students, it's just that I teach research methods, right? So it's the first way I go, and it's like, if you say, for my project, I want to do a survey, and that's what you've decided before you've told me what you want to find out,
It's a problem.
we've got a problem.
Mhm.
Yeah, like, we haven't figured, I'm thinking, okay, I haven't done my job. What?
Mhm.
But it's like the default. It's the default.
And as junk mail, it's now a pain in the ass for everybody who gets it. And so we have this like survey fatigue problem.
Mhm.
How many surveys can you possibly respond to in a given year? And so,
And with a poorly designed survey, you're asking people to spend time, like wasting time.
right.
Yeah.
And there's no
Yeah.
possibility that the outcome could actually be meaningful.
So thanks for showing up, but don't do
Yeah.
it.
Well, there's nothing worse probably for us or anybody to take a poorly designed survey if there are bad questions and incomplete responses. They drive me crazy. Probably because I do them, so often myself. So you do have to spend the time to make it good. Anybody could pull up Facebook and do a Facebook poll, and essentially it's a survey, but that doesn't mean you're gonna get good data. And so not only is there survey fatigue, but there's sort of data fatigue. You've got all these data points, but what actually means anything?
Yeah.
So it's more complicated than that.
What questions do you have?
I have a question for Jeff. You were involved at least once, I think in co-crafting with Melissa, the climate survey for the university. And I think on that one and one before that, for some reason, they asked me for some input. I said, don't ask me, I'm not a survey researcher. It was so hard to do.
Yeah.
Having gone through that process, which takes a long time to do, how did you feel about, like, there's some questions that obviously don't work, but overall, what did you learn from that process of trying to, it's such an important piece of work for the campus?
Yeah, so that survey is a great example of an iterative process of a survey that had a life long before the one that we deployed and possibly after. So over time, it's possible to identify which questions seem to give you more reliable results or seem to provide a variability in response options. Not everyone picks the same response. Over time, the way that you craft the actual language of the question, we came to realize that not everyone who might take the survey would understand all the terms. So we hyperlinked definitions, clear language definitions of terms. This is what we mean by this. And so I think we ended with a better project than we started with.
Do you have any advice on how to title a survey in order to like encourage everybody to equally be interested in it, as opposed to like just the people that are interested in like the hot button issue, maybe already have a strong opinion about it?
That's a tough one because the title needs to be descriptive enough in conveying the questions you're asking. Even the IRB kind of requires that. But sometimes you don't want to disclose everything, right? Especially if you're doing some kind of experiment within the survey. But I don't know, I mean, maybe you need to turn to marketing folks, right? And try to figure out some clickbait type of, desire for them to take it, but yeah.
Junk mail.
I don't know, that's the thing. It's like, how do you get people to take the survey? And really, it goes back to a broader question of how do you get the right people to take it? Meaning a generalizable sample or a representative sample instead of just the people that have time on their hands, at 10 p.m. at night. Because for me, that's one of the most important questions is that sample actually representative of something? Or is it just the people who are in the cafeteria for that hour when you were, trying to encourage people to take it? But that's a long way of saying I don't have an answer for a great title.
Well, and I would say, and I don't know if this has been your experience, Peter, because for the random sampling of at the university, but I'm a fan of still using paper and pencil questionnaires. I think when the researcher is sitting there and saying to students, hey, we're really interested in people's attitudes about relationships. Do you have a few minutes to provide your views? And there might be candy sitting out, that's like the slightest incentive, but if it's something that is remotely interesting, like kind of interested in people's, attitudes about different levels of athletic competition here on campus. Do you have an opinion you want to share? And it doesn't, so the paper and pencil, if you know how to articulate what your study is about and you look like you're invested and you're friendly, students generally have really good experiences getting research participation from others. So I encourage, I know it's using paper, but other people use QR codes like, hey, but and then ask them to do that on their phone right there, right? Scan the QR code and complete it on their phone. But I'm still a fan of the paper pencil technique.
There are some other methods such as paid sites that require funding sources, but we haven't really talked about sampling, but in general, you can just use a convenient sample of whoever is willing to participate, or there are other strategies that one could take if you want a more generalizable sample or have some sort of controls over the quality of the data?
My only answer to this question is that, like, I always try to remind my students that a survey is a social interaction. Right? And the person who receives the survey or who sees the title of the survey, their first question is going to be, who is this from? You know, and if it has the University of Wisconsin Eau Claire stamp on it, that title is going to get interpreted one way. And if it has some other stamp on it, the Eau Claire Area School District, that's going to get interpreted, same title is going to get interpreted a totally different way. And so, you know, and we just didn't do this intuitively, right? Like, who's talking to me? And so I'm going to judge what you say, what you title your survey based on who you are. And just think carefully about, like, what is the nature of this social interaction that I'm engaged in? And how are their judgments of me going to reflect their judgments of the survey? And then how are the judgments of the survey going to reflect back on me?
I'm Cheryl from the Recreation Department, and in the past years, we've administered a survey. NASPA and NERSA partnered to do a benchmark survey on recreational programs and the impact on students. They stopped partnering that a couple of years ago, but said, here, you can take our survey and do whatever you want with it. So we kind of grabbed the survey, made it our own, took out the questions we didn't need. And other folks in our Wisconsin region want to do the same survey. So if we were all, say, you know, 15 schools that want to do the same survey, and we want to benchmark against each other, what recommendations would you have? I think every school has Qualtrics, but is there something else? And then are there resources on campus to help us understand how to set up a quality survey once we hone in on what's our survey about, what do we want to know?
Sure. I think,
Thumbs up on Qualtrics.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
if you have people from multiple universities,
Mhm.
one university can host that. So for example, last year, and I have some specific like rating scale ideas that I was gonna post up here just as like little tidbits. But last year, when I was involved in the UW system survey on students' attitudes toward free expression, the survey was here, like UW Eau Claire Qualtrics hosted that survey, but it went out to 10,000 students, right? Well, it went out to more, but
Mhm.
over 10,000 students took that from 13 different campuses, right? So we just, the logo wasn't UW Eau Claire, so you can put a certain logo on that UW system at the time. So I think that's feasible, and I know Jeff and I both engage regularly with faculty and staff who are designing research tools and analyzing data, and I would be happy to meet to talk about survey design and yeah, I guess.
Thank you for clarification. You're saying we could post it here and send it to all those campuses? We would have to get their permission to get the emails from their students?
Yep.
Or I was assuming we would have contacts at each location that is part of our WRSA conference, and they would be the lead at that campus and send it out and incentivize and collect data, but then we would want access to that data.
You could do
Yeah.
it either way. I mean,
Yeah, and depending on what you're gonna do with the data, then you need to think about the IRB,
right.
depending on what you plan to do.
Could you say more about the IRB for those who may not be familiar?
Yeah, I'm like, oh, that's great. You're gonna have, wonderful data. If you plan to disseminate it, right, and use it for the broader public, then you need to think about submitting a proposal, right, because it involves surveying human subjects.
And we've started that, and we had to do that in the past with the former survey. But how quick is that? When you said 18 months, just a minute.
Well, that was an exception, I think.
First time we did that, like months.
It can.
We know what to put into this.
Sure,
Now
sure.
we've done it before, and we've reached out to them already, but realistically, we're talking about a couple of months for approval or?
I would say just generally a month if
Yeah.
the survey to instrument is in its yearly final format or final format when you submit the application and you take care to provide complete answers, the initial submission for the application. Generally for a study that is not involving any sort of deception or any type of manipulation or treatment, a month.
I would say our IRB here is very good. You know, Mike is very good and they're quick and I push them because I am surveying youth, right? And I'm surveying about risky behaviors. And so I check all the boxes nearly. And I don't deceive them necessarily, but and the earlier you start working with them, they want to see this research be done. So they want to help you bring this project to fruition. So they're not a barrier. They're basically a support system for helping you identify solutions to some of these problems, whether it's consent or, you know, how descriptive you need to be in some of the items. But the earlier you make contact with them, the better. You do have to have a fairly reasonable instrument put together so they can see the kind of questions you're asking and know the kind of population you're addressing. But I would imagine if you got IRB approval at one of the institutions, they could rubber stamp it for the most part at the other institutions. I've worked with other institutions as well, not 15, but a couple have been on projects. And going back to the other question about sampling, it could be that the partners in each of these campuses request and get access to the sampling frame, so the email addresses, and then put that all into one big database that then you send out. I mean, or they could send out the link to the survey themselves. So there's a lot of ways to do it. It's just a matter of what works best for your group.
And following up on that, I'll make a plug to reach out to Melissa Wallace, who is in the room here. She is our research compliance specialist in the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs and kind of the front door to IRB. So if you have questions on the IRB protocol, reach out to Melissa. Thank you. Yes.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth from Housing and Residence Life, and we do a survey every so often that surveys students on different services on campus and the things that housing provides. But one thing that's kind of been a reoccurring issue is incomplete surveys, where there's the housing survey in particular has lots of questions. It can take quite a while for students to get through it. So we see a lot of drop off in our numbers of completed that make it all the way through versus students that make it only halfway. Do you have any advice or thoughts about that?
The first thought that comes to mind is if you can do random samples of students getting different portions of the survey.
That's good. We've done that. Yeah.
You know, if you're getting a good enough sample size, then for each subset, right, then you're getting valuable descriptive information on whatever questions I'm guessing that housing is going to want to ask all the questions
to everybody.
But just don't give all the questions to everybody.
And
Another thing is, I think when you really and this is related to the social interaction, when you have a survey and it feels really humdrum and administrative like, participants lose interest. But when you say, hey, the first thing we want to do in this survey is we want to ask you about your experience on day one in your dorm, you know, that can be a difficult experience. Here's some questions about that. And then you finish those questions and you say, now we'd really like to understand how you felt about the food. So you're just like, you're having a conversation with the participant and they're like, man, okay, I'll tell you about that. You know, just like make them feel like they're a part of it. And then they're more likely to stay with you. Even asking them, are you still paying attention? You choose option 3 right now. You know, just kind of lets them know that you care. You're wanting them to pay attention. Treating them like a participant as opposed to just another number is helpful.
Yeah, and if you've done it in the past, like take a good look at the data you've collected in the past. And did you really use this question? Did it help you at all? Because the more you can trim it back to the shorter the survey, the better. Always. So.
And if students have a clear perception of what is my answer going to turn into? You know, is this going to make a difference in my life or in somebody else's life? They'll be more likely to be motivated to continue. And so if there's a way to communicate, you know, not just that you're a human being, And that we're gonna
that-
use this
yeah.
data, but here's what it's gonna be used
We're gonna get you
for.
some better food.
You're right, exactly.
Yeah.
We wanna
I-
know where to prioritize the work of the RAs,
Mhm.
you
I
know?
mean, Elizabeth, you seem like a prime candidate for being like, let's focus our attention on, like, think about our assessment process. We don't focus on all outcomes and all goals at the same time, right? Like, what are we gonna focus on this year? You'd be the perfect person to rein that
Mhm.
stuff in and
Mhm.
get it in mind. She's fabulous. If you all don't know Elizabeth, you should.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're glad Residence Life has you. Let me pull up a couple against, when I mentioned that free expression
All right,
survey, and
right here.
I've been doing surveys for so long, and yet through that,
Clicker.
Should just start clicking. right?
no, this is fine. There were just a few. During that process, which was really iterative, like Jeff's process was, I had some conversations with people at UW-Madison. They have tremendous support at their the survey center there. And I have a citation here for a primary article. It's an annual reviews piece, so it's kind of dull, but if you're interested in measurement issues, it's good. But one thing is to think about the question that you're asking and really align your response options with what you're asking. So, are you willing to disagree with other students during class? Well, I kind of just gave that as a yes, no question. So those should be my response options, as opposed to how willing are you to disagree with students during class? These options, not at all, a little, somewhat, very willing, extremely willing, are the recommended options. So there are people who just like spend their entire life comparing five set response options. This is not necessarily what comes up as the default in Qualtrics. So when you make a survey in Qualtrics, it's like, this is what you should use. Not necessarily, that's not necessarily what the recommendation is. I have historically been a fan of 7-point scales and 9-point scales, but they argue against them for the primary reason that if you stick with one dimension, meaning don't say strongly disagree to strongly agree, but how much do you agree that? Not at all to a great deal. So how confident are you? Not at all confident to extremely confident. So as opposed to doing a 2-dimensional scale, negative to positive, make a 5-point scale where every point has meaning with respect to the specific question being asked. That was a huge reframing for me, because in psychology, I would say 80% of our scales use strongly disagree,
Yeah.
right? And it's just like, so people quickly get into a response set when you do that.
Yeah.
Right? So I think it's helping people pay attention when you know the specific question you're asking and that the response options go right with it. These are also the options that they recommend for frequency, right? If you can't do something that is series, like, once a week, twice a week, 3 times a week, or exact minutes or hours, but a 5-point subjective option set that's the recommendation. So again, it's kind of a lengthy article, but that's just a couple tidbits that I pulled from that article that have kind of, I hope, improved my survey design since then.
It's a good idea to have some items that would be reverse scored,
Mhm.
or if they're agreeing, they're actually disagreeing with the concept that you're measuring, but it's much better to do that with how you word the actual question itself. You
Yeah.
don't want to be swapping what is like
Yeah.
positive or negative options in your
Yeah, like you
response.
could think about
Yeah.
this one, how willing are you to disagree with other students during class? You could also ask, how afraid are you to disagree with
Right.
other students
Yeah.
during class? And you get kind of 2 different questions, but you're gauging the same kind of idea, right?
Yeah.
So sometimes reverse coded questions can get confusing,
Mhm.
especially with the strongly disagree.
Mhm. If
How
you have a
much do
knot
you
in there,
agree or disagree that
Yeah.
you wouldn't ever cheat on your partner? Like. Anyway, that's just.
Yeah.
Sorry, the examples I use are so ones that hopefully students relate to, so.
With the issue of informed consent, how do you handle students who are 17?
I generally,
Housing them be a big problem.
Yeah, I mean, you have to get parent consent and then child assent, and so with the 17-year-olds on campus, that can be a challenge. So you'd have I guess you could do it in Qualtrics, ask their age, and if they're 17, then they get bumped to a different screen, that might involve, contacting their parent or somehow getting access to them, their parent consenting. But that's, you'd have to, or you just have to exclude 17-year-olds from your sample. It's probably the easiest thing to do, because there's probably not that many. Unless you're generally, you're specifically interested in 17-year-olds perceptions, I would probably exclude them because of that problem. And yet, and what makes matters worse, not to, complicate things, the age of consent for surveys is different depending on your country. So we've done international research before, and the age of consent and where we need parental consent varies. So that creates even more issues.
I think LTS though, or the registrar would give you a distribution like
Sure.
that was 18. So that's a good idea.
Yeah, it can't be too many. I would
Yeah,
think
super
less than
but
a half
the-
percent on campus, I would think.
Yeah, I've done the same thing that Justin has. I've
Uh-huh.
just, if 17-year-olds end up in there, they're gone.
They just get excluded.
Yeah, they
Yep.
just,
Make it fun.
Good question. Maybe you have a specific example or maybe just a general approach when this happens, but have you ever gotten like a results that you were just completely blown away by? And like, what did you do in that case? Did you like, maybe I need to like change the survey, or maybe I need to do another one, or how do you like handle that?
well, if you get a finding that you are really excited about or really surprised about, the number one task in my mind is to replicate. Because you have to ask,
Yeah.
is this, if it's really what you're after, right? Is this too good to be true? Or is it a fluke of a sample? Yeah, I would replicate first.
Or triangulate. If is there another method that can give you a different
Right.
read on the same thing?
Right.
No, that's not a better option than replication, but it's a different one maybe,
Oh,
depending on the
yeah,
situation.
Yeah, totally.
Like a conceptual replicate, yeah.
Yes, it could be a very good thing, but especially if it's particularly different from the existing research. You gotta be prepared for people to question it, the methods, the sample,
Yeah.
So.
I mean, I think going back to the topic that I started with as an example, social media use and mental health. Researchers are debating that stuff back and forth, right? Because depending upon how you ask the questions and how you design, whether it's correlational or experimental, whether how you measure social media use in terms of self-report or experience sampling, just like sampling people at random times of the day, like you just get different responses. And people's perceptions of causes can be different from actual causes, which means you have to triangulate in terms of your research method.
There have been some skills that have been used for several decades without changes to the language, and over time, even though a lot of researchers will still deploy them, you might find that they just don't work, or the response array is nonsensical, and so that's something I've encountered.
One other thought about the what do you do? Some surveys imply action. And nothing is worse than the survey that implies action could be taken on the basis of the results of this survey. And then no action is taken. And so I've managed to talk some people out of doing surveys because they imply that even just suggesting, why don't you answer this question, might be a suggestion that we're going to do something about this. Well, are you going to do something about this?
Campus climate.
Yeah, right, as one possibility. And if you're thinking, oh, we're going to do this survey because we're going to do this initiative, and you get the survey back and people are telling you this would be a terrible idea, and you do it anyway, like, so I guess like, be willing to like walk the walk and not just talk, like be willing to take action on a survey item if your survey implies that, action can or should be taken.
I guess the final caveat to the unique extraordinary finding is, the media is gonna find that. You know what I mean? They're gonna focus on, if you find this thing that's so much different, they're gonna focus on it, and then you're gonna get people calling, and again, you're gonna have to explain yourself, but trust the data. As long as you trust your methods.
Right, so wonderful conversation about designing surveys, and we have some experts if you have further questions to follow up with. So I want to thank April, Jeff, Peter, and Justin for sharing their wisdom, and let's give them a round of applause.